The dog hit the door before anyone else could. Not the handler, not the MPs standing 6 feet back with their hands already raised. Not the trauma surgeon who'd cleared the hall 10 minutes ago and was now pressed flat against the wall like the rest of them. The Belgian Malinois, 90 pounds of muscle and training and something much harder to name, planted himself between the gurney and the room, and every single person in that corridor understood, without being told, that he was not moving. The soldier on the gurney was breathing. That much was clear. Shallow, ragged, each inhale the kind that made you wince to listen to, but breathing. He had a field dressing on his left shoulder that had soaked through twice and a name tape on his chest that the blood had made almost unreadable. His hand, the right one, the one that wasn't strapped down, had a grip on the dog's vest that even unconsciousness hadn't loosened. Hazel Morrow had been a nurse for 6 years. 4 of those at Bethesda, the last 2 at Landstuhl, and the 8 months before this shift at the Walter Reed surgical ward, which was how she'd ended up holding a saline bag in the middle of a hallway at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, watching a military working dog refuse to let a medical team do their jobs. His name is Rook, the handler said. He was young, mid-20s, still had the look of someone who hadn't quite processed what he was standing in the middle of. He won't respond to me right now. He's imprinted on Sergeant Farrow. When Sergeant Farrow goes down in the field, Rook goes into a protection state. We trained for it. We've never had it happen this close to a facility before. Has he bitten anyone? Not yet. Hazel looked at the dog. Rook was watching her the same way she'd seen dogs watch the tree line. Not aggression exactly, but assessment. He was deciding. His ears were forward, his tail low, his whole body oriented toward the gurney like a compass finding north. How long has he been with Sergeant Farrow? 3 years. She handed the saline bag to the corpsman behind her and took 1 step forward. The handler made a sound. I'm not going to rush him, she said. She didn't. She stopped at the edge of what she judged was Rook's threshold. Far enough that he wouldn't read it as a threat, close enough that he could read her, and she crouched down to his level and she waited. The corridor had gone very quiet. Someone's radio crackled and was immediately turned down. Rook's nostrils moved. He was smelling her. She knew enough to know that, and enough to know she couldn't fake whatever he was looking for. Either she was safe or she wasn't, and that was going to be his call, not hers. She held still. 30 seconds, maybe 40. Then Rook took 1 step toward her. Just 1. His nose worked again. His ears shifted, not all the way back, not relaxed, but something between the two. Something that wasn't a decision yet, but might become one. That was when the night charge nurse came around the corner with a security officer and said loudly, "We need to clear this dog from the hall immediately." Rook spun. The handler grabbed for the vest. The security officer stepped back so fast he hit the wall, and Hazel said quietly and very clearly, "Everyone stop." The authority in it surprised even her. She'd used that voice maybe 4 times in 6 years, the kind that came from somewhere lower than training, that didn't ask permission to be heard. Everyone stopped. She looked at the charge nurse. "Give me 5 minutes. Morrow, this is not. 5 minutes. He's not going to let that team in there until he decides it's safe. That's his job. Let me do mine." A long pause. The kind that meant someone was calculating how much paperwork this would generate either way. 5 minutes, the charge nurse said. Hazel turned back to Rook. He was watching her again. The interruption had reset something, and she was starting over, and she knew it, and she didn't rush. She settled her weight back on her heels. She breathed. In through the nose, out slow, the way she'd learned to do in the 6 months after her brother came home from his second deployment and couldn't sleep in a room with the lights off, and she'd sat outside his door enough nights to understand that presence by itself could be a kind of medicine. Rook took another step, then another. He was 2 feet from her now, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept cutting his eyes back to the gurney, the way his whole body was trying to do 2 things at once. Assess the threat in front of him and never stop guarding the man behind him. She turned her left arm slightly so the inside of her wrist was visible, not a deliberate gesture. She did it the way she always did when she was crouched, habit, comfort, the position that kept her shoulder from locking up. Rook's head dropped. He sniffed the inside of her wrist for a long time. On the inside of Hazel's left forearm, running from just below the bend of her elbow to the middle of her wrist, was a tattoo she'd gotten at 22. A dog tag, The real kind, not the decorative kind, the kind with the notch at one end. And wrapped around the chain, a single line from a letter her brother had sent her from Kandahar. Still here. That was all it said. Still here. She didn't know what Rook was reading. She didn't know if it was the ink, or the shape, or something chemical that she couldn't name. She only knew that his ears came all the way forward, and then slowly moved back into something that was almost rest, and he made a sound low in his chest that wasn't a growl. He stepped to the side. The handler exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath for a week. The trauma team moved before anyone said move. The surgery took 4 hours. Hazel was not in the OR. She was floor nursing, not surgical, and her 5 minutes had long since ended. But she checked twice during her rounds, and both times was told Sergeant Farrow was stable. The second time, the surgical resident said it with the particular exhaustion of someone who had expected worse and was still adjusting to the news that it hadn't come. Rook sat outside the OR the entire time. No one tried to move him again. She found out later, from the handler, whose name was Corporal Avery Lint, though she didn't learn that until the third day, that Rook had been with Farrow since Farrow's first operational deployment, that they had cleared buildings together and waited in hides together, and that once, outside a village in eastern Syria, Rook had woken Farrow 20 minutes before an ambush that had killed 2 men in the unit behind them. Nobody had an explanation for what Rook had heard or sensed. Nobody tried to find one anymore. What Lint told her, sitting in the break room at 2 in the morning with his hands wrapped around a cup of bad coffee, was that Rook didn't trust people quickly. Hadn't from the beginning. The trainers had noted it early. Not aggression, not instability, just a particular quality of watchfulness that didn't soften on a schedule. He gave trust the way some men gave it, when he decided, and not before. "What did he smell on you?" Lint asked. Hazel looked at her wrist. She'd pulled her sleeve down out of habit. She usually did, at work, not because she was embarrassed by it, but because patients sometimes asked and the answer took longer than a shift allowed. She pushed the sleeve back now. Lint looked at the tattoo. He was quiet for a moment. "Your brother?" "My brother," he nodded. He didn't ask anything else, and she appreciated that more than she could have explained. Sergeant Farrow woke up on the second day. He was 31 years old, which was younger than he looked, with the particular economy of movement that came from a decade of being very careful about when and how you spent yourself. He didn't talk much. What he said, he meant. Hazel had learned to read that type in 6 years of military nursing. Not coldness, not damage exactly, just a man who had edited himself down to what was necessary. The first thing he said when he was coherent enough to form full sentences was, "Where's Rook?" "Outside," Hazel said. "He's been outside since they brought you in." Farrow closed his eyes. Something moved across his face that he closed down before it finished. "He eat?" "Lint's been with him. He's eating." A breath. "Okay." She was adjusting his IV line when he said, without looking at her, "He let you in." "He did. That doesn't happen." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What did you do?" She told him about crouching in the hall. She told him about waiting. She didn't mention the tattoo. It felt like something to come to in its own time. And he didn't press, but she noticed the way his eyes went to her left arm and stayed there for a half second before he looked away. The next day, she came in for the morning assessment and found a note on his chart that had not been there the night before. In the patient requests field, which was usually blank, someone had written, in handwriting that was angular and compressed and clearly belonged to a man who did not write casually, "Nurse Morrow, if available." She told herself this was not unusual. Patients formed attachments to nursing staff. It was normal, it was healthy in moderate amounts, and it did not mean anything particular about her or about him. She told herself this while she read the note twice. The ward wasn't supposed to work the way it started working in those days. Hazel noticed things she wasn't sure she was supposed to notice. The way the security configuration for the room had been altered twice without explanation. Not the standard rotation, not a change in shift coverage, but something in the arrangement of personnel that made the back of her neck feel wrong when she thought about it too directly. A face she'd seen in the corridor on Monday that she saw again on Thursday near the pharmacy, which wouldn't have meant anything except that the pharmacy was on a different floor and the two locations had no logical foot traffic connection. She mentioned it once to the charge nurse, and the charge nurse gave her a look that meant without saying, Don't. So she didn't. Or she tried not to. What she did instead was pay attention in the quiet way she'd always paid attention, not visibly, not in a way that announced itself. She remembered names. She tracked patterns. She'd done it her whole life, the same way some people hummed without knowing they were humming, and she'd learned a long time ago that this quality was either useful or got you into trouble, and which one it was usually depended on what you found. What she found on the fourth day was a pharmacist she didn't recognize running a medication change on Farrow's chart at 6 in the morning. The change was small. It would have looked, to anyone who glanced at it, like a standard dosage adjustment. But Hazel had pulled Farrow's chart every morning for 4 days, and she knew his medication profile the way she knew her own handwriting, and this change was not consistent with any of his documented responses or the surgical team's documented plan. She flagged it. This was the part of the story, she would think later, where things got complicated in a way that nobody warned you about in nursing school. Flagging was supposed to be simple. You flagged a discrepancy, someone reviewed it, the system caught the error, done. But when she brought it to the charge nurse sent it to the ward supervisor, and the ward supervisor said she'd look into it and then didn't call back. When Hazel followed up 2 hours later, she was told that the change had been authorized and the paperwork was processing. Hazel asked who authorized it. She was told it wasn't her concern. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about it during her lunch break, which she spent at a corner table in the cafeteria not eating. She thought about it during the hour she spent going through the pharmacy records she was technically authorized to access and looking at the name attached to the authorization, which was a name she'd seen before. On a credential badge, on a different floor, on a Thursday, near the pharmacy. She went back to Farrow's room. She didn't tell him what she'd found, not then. She told him she was adjusting his fluids, which was true, and she did that, and she made sure the medication he was receiving was the medication he was supposed to be receiving, and then she sat with the weight of what she knew and what she didn't know and what she was going to have to do with it. Rook was in the corner. He'd been allowed into the room after the first day with Lint present, and by the third day, Lint had started leaving for stretches at a time because Rook had made clear he didn't need supervision to do his job. He was watching Hazel now with the same quality of attention he'd had in the hall, not hostile but total. She had the distinct sense that he was reading the room, all of it, including her. "You found something," Farrow said. She turned. He was watching her. "I don't know what I found yet." But she looked at Rook. Rook looked back at her. "There's a man," she said carefully, "who has a credential for this facility that gives him access to pharmacy. I've seen him twice in places where I wouldn't have expected to see someone with that credential. And this morning, a change appeared in your chart that doesn't match your documented treatment plan, and when I tried to find out who authorized it, I got redirected." Farrow didn't move. That was the thing about him. He didn't react with his body, he processed, and you could see the processing happening somewhere behind his eyes, very fast and very still. "What kind of change?" she told him. He listened. Rook hadn't moved. Then Farrow said, "Call NSIS. I'm a floor nurse. I can't just... Special Agent Brannick. She's on the facility contact list. Tell them I told you to call. Use my name." Hazel looked at him. She thought about the charge nurse's look. She thought about the ward supervisor who hadn't called back. She thought about 6 years of doing a job correctly and quietly and not making the kind of waves that followed you from posting to posting. She thought about Rook in that hallway, planting himself between the gurney and the room and not moving. "Okay," she said. Special Agent Brannick arrived in 45 minutes, which told Hazel that she'd been on the facility for reasons that had nothing to do with this specific call. She was 50, maybe 52, with the kind of face that gave nothing away unless she wanted it to, and she listened to Hazel's account without writing anything down, which Hazel initially took as a bad sign until she realized that Brannick was memorizing it. When Hazel finished, Brannick said, "Walk me through the credential badge. What did it look like?" Hazel described it. Brannick's expression didn't change, but something did. "You said Thursday," Brannick said. "You're certain it was Thursday?" "I'm certain." "What time?" 14:20. 14:25 at the outside. "I was running late for a medication round. You have a good memory." "I have a specific kind of memory," Hazel said. I notice patterns. I can't always explain why something seems wrong. I just know when it doesn't fit. Brannick looked at her for a moment with an expression Hazel couldn't read. Farrow told you to call me, Brannick said. Yes, he trusts you. It wasn't a question quite, but Hazel answered it like one. He trusts the dog. The dog trusts me. I think it filters down. Something that might have been amusement moved through Brannick's expression and was gone. Wait here, she said. What happened after that, Hazel was not present for most of. What she knew was that the man with the pharmacy credential was identified by end of day. What she knew was that there were 3 separate points of entry for what turned out to be not a single error, but a coordinated access pattern. Someone testing what they could reach, and through who and when. What she knew was that the medication change in Farrow's chart was one of 4 anomalies that, once someone was looking for them, were not difficult to find. She knew this because Brannick told her, 2 days later, sitting in the same corner of the cafeteria with the same quality of not quite eating her lunch. You're not going to be thanked officially, Brannick said. I know. The way this gets written, it was a routine internal review. I understand. Brannick studied her. Most people, when I tell them that, are at least a little angry. Hazel thought about it. I'm a night nurse on a surgical ward, she said. Nobody thanks you for that either. The patient gets better, and they go home, and eventually they don't remember your name. That's the job. Brannick left. Hazel went back to her rounds. Farrow was discharged on a Friday. He was mobile, which was remarkable given what he'd come in with, and the surgical team had the particular pride of people who had done an excellent job under pressure and knew it. The paperwork took most of the morning. Hazel was doing her final check, IV out, discharge instructions signed, the small ceremony of it, when Farrow said quietly, "Pull up your sleeve." She stopped. She pushed the sleeve up. He looked at the tattoo, the dog tag, the chain, the 2 words in her brother's handwriting. Still here. What's his name? Farrow said. Caleb, he doing okay? Better now. It took a while. She smoothed her sleeve back down. Rook smelled it. I don't know what he read from it, but it was something that made sense to him. Farrow looked at the dog. Rook was sitting at his feet, oriented toward the door, already thinking about outside, about movement, about the next thing, the way working dogs did when the work wasn't finished. He knows what people are carrying, Farrow said. Always has. The trainers thought it was a liability. Too sensitive, they said. Took too long to decide who to trust. He paused. I told them that was the whole point. Hazel looked at Rook. Rook looked back at her. His ears came forward. Then he did something she hadn't seen him do in 8 days. He stepped toward her, slowly, with none of the assessment of that first night, and pushed his head against her hand. She held still. She let him decide when he was done. He stood there for a long moment, his skull warm and solid against her palm, and she thought about her brother, and about hallways at 2 in the morning, and about all the things you carry that you can't explain to people who weren't there. She thought about what it meant to stand in a corridor and not move, to put yourself between something and whatever was coming, to say, not past me. Rook lifted his head. He looked at her once more, direct and clear, the way dogs did when they'd finished saying what they came to say. Then he turned back to Farrow, and the 3 of them walked out of the room together into the ordinary noise of the morning, and somewhere behind them, the ward went on the way it always did. Monitors beeping. Somebody's IV alarming. A supply cart wheeling down the tile, and Hazel stood in the hall for a moment after they'd turned the corner, her left hand still warm where the dog had been. She pulled her sleeve down. She picked up the next chart. She went back to work.